The aircraft that made modern air warfare possible was never supposed to be vulnerable. On March 27, 2026, ground photos from Prince Sultan Air Base in Saudi Arabia showed an E-3 Sentry with its rear fuselage burned open and its rotating dome still visible above the wreckage. There was no mistaking what it was or what losing it meant. The E-3 Sentry watched everything, told pilots where to turn before they could see what was coming. It shaped the fight before it began. That made it the most important aircraft in the battle space. It also made it the loudest thing in the sky. For 30 years, it was untouchable. Then someone started practicing. For much of its early history, radar carried a built-in limitation that no amount of power could fully solve. Aircraft flying at low altitude could stay hidden below the radar horizon until the final phase of an attack. A ground-based radar set, even when operating at high output, could only see as far as the curvature of the Earth allowed. At sea level, that horizon sits roughly 20 to 30 miles out for low-flying targets. Anything below that line remained invisible until it climbed or closed the distance. By the time a contact appeared on the screen, it was often already close. And even then, detection rarely came as a clean signal. Early radar scopes were crowded with weather returns, sea clutter, interference, and stray echoes. Operators had to pick out a moving aircraft against a background that kept shifting. Sometimes the contact was there, but difficult to isolate. In other cases, it stayed buried in the noise until the aircraft had already closed the distance or reached its attack profile. That was enough to give low-flying attackers the advantage they needed. They did not need to remain hidden for the entire flight. They only needed to stay below the radar long enough to reduce the other side's reaction time. Navies tried to compensate by pushing radar picket ships forward, placing them dozens of miles ahead of the main fleet. That extended the detection line, but it also exposed the sensor. A picket ship was easier to find and easier to target than the force it was meant to protect. In several cases, it became the first casualty of an attack it was supposed to warn against. On land, the geometry was less flexible. Radar sites were fixed, and the terrain made the problem worse. Hills, coastlines, and built-up areas broke the radar picture into segments. Gaps formed between coverage zones. Skilled pilots could plan routes that threaded through those gaps and appeared only when they were already in position to strike. The problem was not just spotting an aircraft. It was understanding what it was, where it was going, and what to do about it before it was too late. A fragmented picture forced defenders into a defensive posture. A clear, continuous picture allowed them to act first. More range alone would not solve it. What they needed was time. So the obvious answer was to take the radar into the air. The United States started doing exactly that during World War II. In 1944, Project Cadillac pushed early warning radar off the surface and into the air. After the war, that concept continued in aircraft such as the EC-121 Warning Star, proving that airborne radar could extend coverage that surface systems simply could not. By the Cold War, though, extended warning was no longer enough. In practice, the system was still split across different radars, command posts, and aircraft. One node found the contact. Another tried to classify it. Someone else decided what to do. Then the instruction had to reach the pilot in time to make a difference. That process burned time at every stage, and in air combat, time usually decided who acted first. Bombers, strike aircraft, and later cruise missiles could exploit that delay, while jamming and denser traffic made it harder to build a clear picture from scattered returns. An aircraft equipped with radar could see farther, but it still could not solve the broader command problem on its own. By the time the Air Force began shaping the next generation, it was looking for more than a flying radar. It wanted an aircraft that could find a contact, hold it, make sense of it, and help direct the response while there was still time. In this new direction, the aircraft overhead would not simply pass raw returns down the chain. It would help build the picture in real time and provide a clear direction for the forces below. That's where airborne warning turned into airborne command and control. And that is the idea that led to the E-3 Sentry. It was built around the Boeing 707-320B, a large 4-engine airframe that gave the Air Force the range, endurance, and internal space the mission demanded. The fuselage measured about 152 feet in length, with a wingspan of roughly 145 feet, but the feature that defined the aircraft sat above the body. Mounted on 2 struts over the fuselage was a rotating radar dome, about 30 feet in diameter, and weighing roughly 12,000 pounds. It turned at about 6 revolutions per minute, giving the aircraft continuous 360-degree coverage. The dome did more than make the E-3 instantly recognizable. It made its role clear. The aircraft was built to stay at altitude and watch a very large section of airspace without interruption. At around 30,000 feet, its radar could monitor more than 115,000 square miles, and under favorable conditions, detect targets at ranges beyond 250 miles. That broader view could then be passed outward to fighters, tankers, and command nodes, allowing them to operate from a single picture rather than isolated fragments. Headings, altitude assignments, target locations, and identification could all be distributed while the fight was still unfolding. The pilot below no longer had to piece the fight together alone, in the cockpit, while trying to survive inside it. That work was already happening overhead. By integrating detection, tracking, identification, communication, and direction in a single aircraft, the E-3 turned airborne warning into airborne control. The first E-3 entered operational service in 1977 at Tinker Air Force Base in Oklahoma, where it was tied into NORAD's air defense network. From there, it flew alert missions that required it to maintain radar coverage across large sectors and respond on short notice to unknown aircraft approaching North American airspace. In 1978, the E-3 was used to track and assist in intercepting drug smuggling aircraft over Florida. These were low, quiet targets trying to slip through coverage gaps, precisely the kind of target the E-3 had been built to track. Using pulse Doppler processing, it could separate moving targets from terrain returns, sea reflections, and noise. That allowed it to hold tracks more reliably. Over Florida, the E-3 detected the aircraft, maintained the track, and passed that information to interceptors before the targets disappeared again. Soon after, one of the aircraft's first major deployments sent E-3s to Kadena Air Base in Japan, where they entered one of the most sensitive air defense environments of the Cold War. From there, they monitored Soviet and regional air activity across a wide area, maintaining a more continuous picture in airspace where delays and gaps had long been expected. That performance quickly drew NATO's attention. The alliance faced the same problem of defending crowded airspace against a peer threat, and it reached the same conclusion. By the early 1980s, NATO had committed to a fleet of 18 E-3 aircraft for its own air defense network. By that point, the E-3 had become part of how the U.S. Air Force expected to fight. That's why, when coalition aircraft crossed into Iraqi airspace in January 1991, the E-3 was already there. It was orbiting well behind the fight, holding a position that allowed it to watch the entire battle space without entering the most dangerous airspace. From that altitude, its radar was already sweeping hundreds of miles in every direction, building a continuous picture before the first strike packages reached their targets. Inside the aircraft, the fight already existed as a usable picture, not as raw returns waiting for someone else to sort out. The E-3 carried a mission crew that usually brought the total complement to around 17 to 25 people. The flight crew sat forward, and behind them, operators worked the radar and communications consoles, turning a mass of returns into a coherent picture. They tracked contacts as they moved, sorted threats from clutter, and pushed the most urgent information out before the situation changed again. An F-15C pilot entering Iraqi airspace could already know where to turn, what altitude to hold, and what kind of aircraft he was being sent toward. The intercept was not improvised, it was guided. On the Iraqi side, the situation was different. Their pilots still depended on onboard radar and ground control to build their picture, a process that took time. Contacts appeared later, identification came under pressure, and the response followed behind the developing situation. By the time an Iraqi pilot detected a coalition aircraft, that aircraft was often already in position. The geometry of the fight had already been shaped. The E-3 compressed the time between detection and action, enabling coalition fighters to act sooner rather than react late. During Desert Storm, coalition aircraft shot down 32 Iraqi fixed-wing aircraft in aerial combat. Iraqi pilots failed to shoot down a single U.S. Air Force aircraft in return. As the campaign continued, many Iraqi aircraft stopped contesting the airspace altogether. A total of 121 Iraqi fixed-wing combat aircraft were flown to Iran, where they were never returned. The next test was scale. During Operation Allied Force over Yugoslavia in 1999, NATO brought together aircraft from more than a dozen countries. They flew from bases in Italy and Germany, from carriers in the Adriatic, and from forward locations across the region. At its peak, the operation involved over 900 aircraft from 14 nations, operating from more than 40 different sites. On any given day, hundreds of sorties shared the same airspace. Strike aircraft, escorts, tankers, electronic warfare platforms, and reconnaissance flights were all moving through the same corridors, often on tight schedules and at overlapping altitudes. Without coordination, that kind of density creates friction quickly. Aircraft arrive out of sequence. Tanker orbits conflict with strike routes. Delays cascade across the entire operation. In that environment, the E-3 became necessary to manage the airspace. From its orbit, the aircraft maintained a continuous picture of every participating platform, a coordinated timing between strike packages, suppression of enemy air defenses, and supporting assets. Tankers were held on predictable tracks, so fighters could refuel without disrupting the flow. Reconnaissance aircraft were given clear lanes to operate without interference. That level of control kept the operation from breaking down under its own weight. This became clear when, following the attacks of September 11th, NATO invoked Article 5 for the first time in its history. As part of the response, Airborne Warning and Control Systems, or AWACS aircraft, were deployed over the United States under Operation Eagle Assist. Beginning in October 2001, NATO E-3s flew patrols over North America, providing airborne warning and control over domestic airspace. 7 E-3 aircraft flew 360 operational sorties, logging nearly 4,300 flight hours over the United States before the mission ended in May 2002. Air defense over North America then shifted into continuous operations under programs such as Operation Noble Eagle. E-3 aircraft remained part of that structure, maintaining a live picture over airspace that handled tens of thousands of civilian flights each day. Every track had to be accounted for. At the same time, the fleet carrying that responsibility was not growing. A total of 68 E-3s had been built. By the early 2000s, the U.S. Air Force operated only a few dozen, and that number continued to decline as the aircraft aged. Maintenance demands increased, and availability tightened. And yet, dependence created another weakness. The more central the E-3 became, the more damage a human mistake could do. One such incident occurred in April 1994, during Operation Provide Comfort in northern Iraq. The mission existed to protect Kurdish populations after the Gulf War inside a no-fly security zone above the 36th parallel, an area roughly 160 by 70 kilometers. By then, coalition aircraft had flown 27,000 fixed-wing sorties and 1,400 helicopter flights in support of the operation. That morning, a U.S. Air Force E-3 from the 963rd Airborne Air Control Squadron took off from Incirlik Air Base in Turkey with a 19-member crew. It took station at 32,000 feet, just north of Iraq, providing airborne warning and control for the entire mission area. Soon after, 2 U.S. Army UH-60 Blackhawks from Eagle Flight departed Turkey for the Military Coordination Center at Zaku, Iraq. They were fitted with external fuel tanks, marked with large American flags, with more flags painted on the doors, nose, and belly. They reported entry into the no-fly zone to the AWACS controller, and their tracks appeared on the scope. Friendly helicopter tags were added to indicate their presence. After landing, the helicopters picked up 16 passengers and departed again for Erbil. The AWACS crew resumed their track, and on multiple scopes inside the E-3, the helicopters were visible as friendly aircraft. Later that day, 2 Air Force F-15Cs took off from Incirlik on a fighter sweep. One pilot picked up a low, slow radar contact. The AWACS crew had enough information to question what they were looking at. But no one gave a clear warning or steered the intercept away before it turned into an engagement. As the F-15s descended for visual identification, the flight lead called Tally 2 Heinz, wrongly identifying the 2 Blackhawks as Iraqi Mi-24 attack helicopters. The call was heard inside the AWACS, but no decisive correction came. So one F-15 fired an AIM-120 AMRAAM from about 4 nautical miles and destroyed the trailing helicopter. About 20 seconds later, the second fighter fired an AIM-9 Sidewinder from about 1.5 nautical miles and destroyed the lead helicopter as it tried to dive away. All 26 people on board the 2 Blackhawks were lost, including US, British, French, and Turkish personnel. The failure stemmed from a chain of bad assumptions, poor integration, weak procedures, and people who did not act on the information at hand. The E-3 provided clarity. It could not force anyone to use it correctly. The E-3's concentration of radar, communications, and battle management into a single aircraft made it powerful. It's also what made the aircraft seem unusually survivable for most of its career. In its preferred mission profile, the E-3 stayed well back from the forward edge of the fight, scanning outward from a distance. Any attacking aircraft had to cross a long stretch of watched airspace before it could get close. Additionally, the E-3 was rarely alone. Fighter escorts protected it, and the aircraft's own radar gave those fighters time to engage threats long before they reached missile range. That's why the aircraft developed a reputation for being one of the most survivable platforms in the sky. One of the engineers involved in early vulnerability studies, Jim Groupé, described the logic clearly by saying that if an enemy fighter came toward the aircraft, quote, "we would simply call up our own fighters to take them out." According to Groupé, the radar picture was detailed enough that the crew could often determine not only that an aircraft was approaching, but also what kind of aircraft it was and what armament it carried, long before it could threaten the AWACS itself. However, long-range air-to-air missiles changed the geometry. Systems such as the Russian R-37M and Chinese PL-15 are often described at ranges of roughly 150 to 300 kilometers when supported by off-board targeting. Surface-to-air systems, such as the S-400 and the HQ-9 family, apply the same pressure from the ground. The launch platform no longer has to close the distance the old way. It only needs targeting data good enough to put the missile into the right volume of sky. To do its job, the aircraft has to radiate continuously. Its radar searches across a wide area, and its communication systems transmit constantly to keep the picture moving across the force. In electronic warfare terms, that makes it one of the most conspicuous emitters in the battle space. An enemy does not need to be close to know that something large, active, and important is there. The Sentry did have defensive measures, including electronic countermeasures and chaff and flare systems meant to disrupt incoming missiles. Even so, Groupé concluded, quote, "survivability was under 3 minutes unless the countermeasures were successful, which many times they are, but many times are not." In 2021, satellite imagery showed 2 full-size E-3 mock-ups on a Chinese missile range in the Gobi Desert. They were not generic aircraft shapes, as they clearly carried the Sentry's unmistakable rotodome and sat on a prepared target area inside a major weapons test complex. It was clear that the People's Liberation Army was practicing how to find and destroy this type of aircraft. It was even more concerning since at the time, the US had just 31 E-3s on hand. The more the fight depended on it, the more it stood out as a target. That may already have entered the real world. On March 27, 2026, reporting described a strike on Prince Sultan Air Base in Saudi Arabia. A handful of E-3s were there, holding the air picture together over the Gulf from one of the main American operating bases in the region. Then a strike came in. Reporting described a mixed attack of 6 ballistic missiles and 29 drones, built to catch aircraft before they could ever climb out of danger. The ballistic missiles came down fast and steep. The drones arrived at different times and from different profiles, forcing defenders to split their attention between threats that required different responses. One wave forces the defense to react. Another arrives through the confusion. In that kind of attack, even defensive radars become a liability because the moment they emit, they also reveal their position. One of the aircraft caught in the strike appears to have been E-3, serial 81005. Ground photos showed the rear fuselage burned out, the skin peeled back, and debris scattered across the ramp. It did not matter whether it had taken a direct hit or a near miss. The result was the same. The aircraft was lost. The strike also damaged at least 5 KC-135 tankers and wounded 10 U.S. service members, with 2 reported seriously injured. What made the loss worse was the timing. The United States had already sent 6 E-3s to the Middle East before the war began, and back home, the fleet had already been cut to 16 aircraft. Even that number overstated the real capacity available. Reporting on the fleet's condition put the average mission-capable rate in fiscal 2024 at about 55.68%, which meant only a fraction of those aircraft were actually ready to launch at any given time. Compounding matters, there was no quick way to replace it. The E-3 was built on a 707-derived airframe that had been out of production for decades, and the capability it carried was far larger than the metal itself. Its replacement, the E-7, was supposed to take over that role, but the transition remained uncertain and slow. The old Air Force figure for an E-3 was about $270 million in 1998. Recent reporting has put the E-7 at more than $700 million per aircraft. However, the loss reached far beyond the aircraft itself. The aircraft that once made the battlespace legible was itself found, fixed, and destroyed.